Coming out to the Columbus Museum of Art on such a cold evening and braving the weather to get here to be with us tonight. My name's Lauren Emond. I'm the Member Relations Manager here at the museum. So this evening we're really excited to have a wonderful artist visiting us from Cincinnati to talk about his work this evening. Jordan Tate is an assistant professor of art at the University of Cincinnati. He has a Bachelor of Philosophy and Interdisciplinary Studies from Miami University and a Master of Fine Arts and Photography from Indiana University, and was a Fulbright Fellow to Germany in 2008 and 2009. His work is currently held in collections nationwide, including, I hope I pronounced this right, Rhizome at the New Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, and the Fred and Laura Ruth Bidwell Collection, the Cincinnati Art Museum, and the Columbus Museum of Art, as well as the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Jordan currently has a show in Copenhagen, and he has a new show titled Working from Photographs that will open next Thursday at the Angela Maleka Gallery. We have some postcards out on the table when you leave here. Grab one of these. The reception is next Thursday, and that exhibit runs through April 11th. So without any further ado, please welcome Jordan Tate.
Okay. I'm going to wait for the lights to be appropriate. Here they come. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. This is a really exciting opportunity for me to discuss some new trends in my work and some new things I've been thinking about. I'm going to sort of lay the groundwork with probably 30, 40 minutes of background thinking about sort of how I got to where I am with the Working from Photographs series that's going to open. It's a two-part exhibition. The first part opens, as mentioned, at the Angela Maleka Gallery on Thursday. The second part opens on March 15th at the Denny Gallery in New York City. And I'll discuss the implications and structures of that two-site exhibition later. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the trajectory of where this is headed. So if you do have any questions throughout the lecture, feel free to stick up a hand. We can try and keep this casual because it's not a gigantic group. And if we end up going a little bit over, so be it. Then we'll just have less time for questions at the end. But generally speaking, the tone that I want to strike for today's talk is one of philosophical buoyancy. And what I mean by that is I want to engage in a discussion and analysis of photography as it pertains to our understandings of the world and in a manner that sort of enriches our experiences and provides additional contexts that we can engage in. I want to address these notions that I feel like we're all affected by in one way or another, but to address them as notions to be considered, not necessarily notions that need to be acted upon. And throughout the talk and in many of my pieces, you'll see this idea of duality or a point-counterpoint. And I think the argument I'm largely making is that there's ultimately no right and there's no wrong. There's only information that merits discussion and consideration, and I'm trying to sort of bring that dialogue to the viewer through my works. And again, sort of in this non-position-taking mentality, I'm not attempting to create any sort of hierarchical structure of the photograph or of what photography should be or what photography is. I just want to engage in a real discussion about the implications of the medium as a whole, how it's used, how it can be used as an image and as an object. So I think there's really interesting dialogues about both going on right now. And to that end, I'm going to move a little bit rapid fire through some projects and pieces that are all deeply related to each other in that sort of overarching discussion of the photograph and my photographic philosophy, and ones that approach this sort of theme from various perspectives. So I am omitting entire bodies of work. The two primary exhibitions that I am not showing work from are the current exhibition in Copenhagen, which is called Drape Wave, which is a collaboration with a fantastic artist named Rick Silva, but it's not particularly germane to my discussion today. And as well as I'm unfortunately only cursorily addressing my most recent museum show at the Transformer Station in Cleveland. So that happened about a year ago. It was a really exciting adventure, but it's a little bit more enlightenment and a little bit less romanticism, and we're going to be a little bit more Caspar David Friedrich today. I don't know if there are any Caspar David Friedrich works here, but if there are, you should go see them. If there aren't, sorry. I'm going to move on awkwardly. Okay, so I'm going to begin by sort of having a discussion of some of the structures, ideas, or containers that I try and use to foster this hopefully rich and productive discussion of photography. And by extension, a discussion about our general epistemologies and our constructions of our belief systems and understandings of the world. And I think this is a really important idea for me. I view the photograph and our relationships with the photograph as a microcosm of how we parse, contextualize, and understand everything. I don't mean this as some exaggeration. I mean literally everything. And I'll sort of expand upon the relationship between photography and writing and that fundamental restructuring of thought as we progress. But I really want to emphasize that when I say everything, I absolutely mean it. So considering the epistemology of the word object, whose Latin and Greek roots both suggest the notion of opposition. It suggests the idea of the thrown against. It speaks very clearly to me in two ways. First, the object serves as referent for experience, and meaning that it is an object that grants us our subjecthood. Like, I am not this podium, I am not this stage, I am not my computer, you are not the chairs you are sitting in. You are apart from them, and in that separateness, you begin in some way to define yourself as an entity apart from the rest of the world. And additionally, we fundamentally understand things equally by exclusion and inclusion. And I'm arguing here that we primarily construct meaning based on context. So how we receive something is equally about what it is and what it isn't. So I think because of this, I find this to be a much more comfortable position. I think it's more ambiguous, but it's nice for me because I'm not necessarily cast out in the world saying I am not that, because I am I and I am not chair. There's a duality there that I think provides a nice sort of gravitational balance. So it just gives you a ground to be separate from. And I think maybe a better analogy than me and chair. Imagine yourself just for a brief moment as an entity in space, right? No gravity, nothingness, you're floating. Without resistance, without an object that you are not, you can't go anywhere. You can't just wave your arms in space and start moving. If you have a ball and you throw said ball, then you can begin to move in relation to the ball with the sort of equal speed or equal momentum that you've given the ball. So there is that counterpoint that I think naturally exists in the universe, and I'm just really trying to celebrate and acknowledge that without necessarily taking a firm position on either side. So I guess without going into a super long string of metaphors that I believe illustrate this fundamental notion of humankind, I'm going to lay out the simplest one that discusses the idea of context in the image. And that is, it is the walls that change an empty space into a room. If you just have an empty space, it is an empty space. If you put up 4 walls, all of a sudden, that empty space is a room. And this is a sort of really simple way for me to say that context is king, and the boundaries are what allow us to understand, identify, and exist within certain ideas and or spaces. Are you with me so far? I see heads nodding up and down in the good way. Okay, so in digital imaging, there's a really interesting idea that's super banal until you think about it as a philosophical metaphor. And I don't want to get into this overly technical rhetoric, but the idea is gamut. Okay, and for those of you who have no experience with digital imaging, gamut is defined as a complete subset of possibilities. And a very simple way to picture a gamut is to imagine a jar on a desk, right? So gamut is traditionally used in this context as all of the colors that a material, a photographic print, a camera, is capable of reproducing. But I think it's a richer metaphor. The idea of a gamut as a context, as the walls that build the room, becomes really interesting. Because if you have a defined subset, that implies a superset, a set above the subset. So if you have a jar on a desk, that jar is on a desk. That desk is in a room. That room is in a building. That building is in a city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can sort of expand ad infinitum. And I think when bounded, when you have confinement, when you have boundaries, when you have a means of analyzing, it makes this rigorous exploration of the container all the more rich and all the more rewarding. And I think that also said, not all containers are as discrete as the jar on the desk. And I think that's where the photograph gets really interesting for me, because it's a really nebulous container. It's sort of like a cloud in the room, and you don't really know that you're in this cloud until you get far enough outside of it. You pass the fringes, you step into sort of clear skies out from the fog, and then you look back upon where you were and realize that you were surrounded by mist. And I think there's this really interesting fluidity, ambiguity, and pervasiveness that notion of the photograph as cloud provides to my thinking about the image. And the reason that I'm launching into so many metaphors is because I think that nothing is really simple, particularly when it's something as ubiquitous and influential as the photograph or the idea of photography. So a little bit more about Gamut. Gamut, in a different way than photography, is not arbitrary, right? It's governed by need and possibility, and those things are rigorously managed by what industry, capitalism, etc., determines is valuable. So the color on the left here is the closest digital approximation of Yves Klein blue, okay? We can't make Yves Klein blue. Well, we can. We choose not to have the ready capability of making Yves Klein blue. Yves Klein was a fantastic artist who worked with a French pharmaceuticals company to come up with this extremely iridescent, gorgeous, sort of ultramarine blue pigment, right? So it's chemically made. Current printing technologies, all of them that exist, Yves Klein blue is outside of the gamut. So that means it's outside of the possibilities of the device to reproduce that certain color. Now, if Yves Klein blue were suddenly Coke red, I think in short order, every device would be able to produce this color. So it's not that we're technically incapable, it is that as a society or as a capitalist entity, we have decided certain things are valuable, certain things are not. And again, this isn't really creating a hierarchy. I'm not saying that the world desperately needs Yves Klein blue and therefore we should make sure that every printer can print Yves Klein blue, because there's literally been one time in my life when I was like, that'd be really nice. But then when it wasn't a possibility, it became a really interesting dialogue. And I think that's what speaks to me powerfully about the notion of industrial production as a crucial context in artistic production. The context that we work within, the photograph, sets of paint, pigments, etc., are imposed upon us artificially. But we never really consider, we often consider the confines of the structures we find ourselves in, right? We consider the jar on the desk, but we never think about Bell Corporation, who decided to make that jar that size, that shape for some reason. So the puppet masters, this sounds really anti-capitalist. I don't know what's going on today. The people who structure our experiences often are afforded the luxury of doing so invisibly. And I think that is a phenomenal connection to the photograph, because the photograph does the same thing, and we all do the same thing with the photograph, but we believe we do so invisibly. We don't acknowledge the imposition, the alteration, the recontextualization, or the effect that the photograph has on both ourselves and on the objects that we're photographing. Okay, so that long-winded, I guess I'll call it a diatribe, is sort of my way of introducing the idea that the containers we deal in are not discrete. They are not solitary. They are subsets of other containers. They are subsets of other contexts, and we form our relationships to one media based on overlap, affiliation, or rejection with another, based on difference, based on inclusion, based on exclusion. And I think they expand upon the notion that the gamut, or the container, again, governs experience. Nothing is ever simple, and nothing can be unaffected by either its context or its contents. So we are changed, or the contents of the jar are affected by manufacturing decisions of Bell Jar Company, but also the jar is affected by what's inside of it. So this is a dialogue that goes both ways. And I think pursuant to that, a lot of the images I use are reclaimed, appropriated, or, well, I guess that's it. They're just appropriated, a lot of them. Some of them are taken, some of them are appropriated, and I don't distinguish which ones are which. And I do this unabashedly, and not in a manner that's intended to start a question of authorship, but in a manner that's intended to kind of trouble our understandings of context and acknowledge the fundamentally appropriative nature of photography as a medium based on essentially the reassembly of existing shapes and forms, right? So even thinking of the nomenclature of photography, we capture a moment, we take a photograph. It's a possessive, appropriative gesture for a likewise appropriative action. So I guess I'm arguing that the creativity and the power and the beauty of photography is in this idea of assemblage, whether that assemblage happens with existing forms or existing photographs. And my argument is that I don't differentiate between, in my practice, I don't differentiate between buying a box at Walmart to photograph or finding a photograph of a box online to work with. To me, essentially, the idea of authorship is the same there. Although I know there's a lot more, well, I'm not going to go into that. So essentially, in my non-position taking stance, this is not a photographer standing up here telling you that my medium is the best and therefore everyone should work in it. This is an artist standing up here saying that whether you like it or not, it's too late. You already work with photography. You are already a photographer, regardless of your philosophical relationship to the medium, your ownership of a camera, your ability to use that camera, or your understanding of any imaging process. You are at your core affected by the photograph. And I think this is where we get into a really interesting analogy and discussion of language, or something that I find really powerful. We're all literate, in a sense, before we're able to read and write. The heavy lifting of writing is already done by the time we learn to associate symbols with sounds and combine those sounds into words and those words with meanings. And I think a great way to think about this is if you've ever hung out with a child who can't read, they still speak in English if you're in an English-speaking country, with generally appropriate grammar, syntax, and structure. I went to the park today. That is literate speech, right? Before writing, speech was vastly different. So we are essentially creating a society where you can't be illiterate even if you can't read and write, because your thought processes, the introduction of narrative, the introduction of structure, the introduction of recollection and repeatability, all of those things that writing bore to humankind are implicit in our sort of pre-literate speech. And my argument is that we have the same effect from photography. And I really like Monet to discuss this phenomenon because I think it puts a really interesting spin on it. It's at once clean and really complicated. For those of you familiar with the painting Impression Sunrise, it's the flagship, or at least the naming inspiration for Impressionism. And I think it's also, fundamentally, I group it in this context of photography, because it was one of the first paintings that was having to struggle with what photography stole from painting. Up until 1839, the primary means of representing the world in any sort of fashion, either accurately or within fantasy, was through painting. And I think there's a really interesting, I've dug around really hard, and if there's an art historian who can tell me I'm wrong on this, I'd be really sad and excited at the same time. There's not a single abstract painting existing before the invention of photography, because the paradigm of painting was so firmly set in this idea that you had to represent the world that was put in front of you or that you organized, right? But when photography hit, it was like, whoa, someone came into my playhouse and stole all of my toys, so what can I build now? And I think that's where Impressionism really, unfortunately, gets a bad rap, and Monet particularly. I know that in sort of common museum-going audiences, he doesn't get a bad rap because he makes really gorgeous paintings, but I think in more critical theoretical or art historical circles, he doesn't necessarily get the credit he deserves, because the work that the Impressionists were making was sort of really revolutionary and conceptual and anti-photographic. And again, it's this idea that we're defining things in opposition, not in position. So it took photography's invention for Impressionists to say, man, what do we do now? What are we? Like, I thought we had it figured out, but that's been taken from us. So we're not that anymore, because that's done exactly what we wanted to do. It's taken that from us. So we're against that now. We're going to be opposed to that, and in doing so, we're not going to try and capture facts anymore. we're going to go with impressions. And I think that was a really beautiful moment in the history of painting. And I think both of these media, photography and painting, are fundamentally born out of a discussion with capability and limitation. And I think this is a really beautiful dichotomy to me and something I think about pretty frequently. It's the idea that everything, every super powerful force, I would say writing, photography, and the internet are sort of the three most powerful forces that I can think of in restructuring the way we approach the world. They change our experience with the world. So imagine yourself, and we're going to get to Machu Picchu later, because I'm a super huge fan. But raise your hand if you've seen a picture of Machu Picchu. Okay, so close your eyes, picture yourself in Machu Picchu. With 98% certainty, I can say that you're all picturing pretty much the same vantage point, right? Because there's pretty much one vantage point of every picture of Machu Picchu. Now, no one thinks, they think that's probably the sort of best general view, which is a sort of photo-historical reference to some early landscape photography of the West. But probably it's because it's the only spot that you're actually allowed to walk where you can see the town and the mountain. So our experience at Machu Picchu is already predetermined without us having to go there. And I think there's a really interesting problem there, right? So the idea that we could, so I guess fundamentally, that experience of us being able to Google search Machu Picchu and have that search alter any future experience we have with that site, to me, places photography or the internet inside that sort of cloud of the photograph, right? I view them as fundamentally the same entity where the internet is an extension of the photograph. And I sort of want to riff on that for a second. So with the photograph, I think the idea that we could fix the natural world onto paper is just the tip of the iceberg. The idea that we could make it portable, that's what was truly remarkable. Photography became, and I'm arguing, remains rooted in the idea that we have a desire to experience the world that's not directly in front of our faces right now. And at the same time, it's a mediation on this experience that can't be ignored. So I used to give a really an hour-long theory lecture on just these images, right? And now that I have a couple years distance from it, this showed at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland in 2011, I realized that my discomfort with the boundaries of the photograph were, in a lot of ways, self-imposed. I wanted to I was displeased with the utility and the lack of, I think, critical engagement with the implications of the medium. And I think I was acting under the assumption that that was a necessary dialogue to have. And therefore, I was imposing all of these problems upon myself, and each piece is me trying to solve a specific problem in a specific way and have a reasonably didactic discussion of what it means to exist in a landscape of contemporary photography. But when I realized that photography is culturally defined in a specific way, when it is this cloud in the room that I can't control, I can only see and experience when I step out from, I was sort of choosing to accept that definition rather than to work within it, work from outside of it, and just see what I could do, poking at the boundaries and exploring and experiencing and experimenting. And that sort of took me into this really interesting dialogue with Romanticism. And I think that photography's definitely reached a critical mass. There's really no point in fighting it. You can't change the course or change people's ultimate understandings of what it means to be a photograph because it's so frequently reinforced. And we're going to do another thought exercise. This one's a little bit crazier than Machu Picchu. So picture yourself at a college party, on the porch, you red cup of beer, and then all of a sudden a clown rides by on a unicycle, right? We're all going to get out our phones. We're all going to photograph that clown. And then we're going to look at the clown on our phones right after we photograph it. And that cycle of the mechanical reproduction of reality, devoid of context, is reproduced because we were there, the clown is here, and our experience of seeing the clown has now sort of been passed into that particular photograph, but only for us, right? So I think because we each have such a personal experience with image making, it's really difficult to turn the tide or basically like alter the course of the Titanic without like a serious fight. So I've decided that in some ways I should think about becoming a trim tab. And this is are there any pilots in the audience? Okay. Buckminster Fuller, who I'm a big fan of, on his headstone it says, "Call me trim tab." A trim tab is the smallest moving part on an airplane. And the logic there that he was getting at is that through persistence, through incremental small force applied over a long span of time, you can ultimately alter the course of something, right? But I think for me, I'm not particularly interested in any specific alteration of the course of the photograph. I just don't want it to solidify. I don't want it to be a consistent entity. I want to celebrate that sort of romantic notion of the magic of the image, of the representation of reality that's troubled and challenging and interesting. I sort of want to poke and prod and stretch at the boundaries of the photograph at the same time while challenging our understanding of the images and acknowledging the path of art history and the history of photography. So while I admit that choosing to accept these things rather than sort of have a revolutionary gesture of flipping over the table and forcefully recontextualizing the medium was appealing, I realized that that wasn't an enjoyable position to have, right? I realized that I was much more, not more critically engaged, but more judgmental in earlier works about uses of the medium. And I think because I was failing to step outside of the cloud, if any of you have ever been in a really dense fog, if you are stuck deep within a dense fog, you can really only see as far as your hand, right? You can't really get a feel for the room around you, other people in the fog. And I think that singular perspective was something that I craved an expansion of. So I think the notion that the photograph didn't exist was really one of that, the greatest tricks that photography ever pulled. And I think that's what spurred painting towards Impressionism and photography towards like the mechanical reproductive modernist dialogue that it had following its invention. And I think we only acknowledge that the process of photography exists when it challenges our expectations. So when we see Photoshop disasters, or when we see like the click hole 15 things you can't believe are real, things like that are when we acknowledge the medium as an entity. But I think otherwise it sort of just like passes right through us. So now that the stage is a little bit set and muddled and confusing in hopefully a productive way, and we've begun to talk about containers and boundaries that define a space, I want to talk about some about the myriad containers that sort of define and structure my work. And this new working methodology that I've come to is one of an informed exploration that is also bound to the notion of gamut, limit, and possibility. I want to see what happens when I throw one thing against another. And I think this is essentially the point. Each process, input, translation, or output has a very specific set of attributes that govern its perception. And I aim to address this phenomenon both physically and through the materiality of a lot of recent works. And I think conceptually through the content chosen, the act of photographing said content, it makes the process of making the piece integral to the piece itself. And I think this is a quintessential example of my process. This is also the piece that's on Short North right now, and it's in the collection here at the Columbus Museum of Art. And the cyclical nature of this work and the manner in which it came about become a really self-referential discussion of its own production. A few years ago, I had a studio visit with Catherine Evans, who is now the chief curator of the Carnegie Museum of Art, who used to be the endowed curator of photography here. She had chosen my work for an exhibition at the Heron Galleries at the IUPUI in Indianapolis, and I had this one scroll in my studio of a digitally produced bust printed on a 3D printer. I found a bust of the Venus de Milo, and if any of you are familiar with sort of 3D modeling, it probably had like, I don't know, 500,000 polygons. So 500,000 tiny little shapes that when you zoom in, like you can see said shapes, but it makes up the larger three-dimensional sculpture. I downsampled that to about 100. So it was a really chunky, blocky, low-res Venus de Milo that was semi-recognizable. I had it 3D printed, I cast it in plaster, photographed it on a plinth, put it on a scroll, and hung it on the wall. So Catherine saw this and she said, "That's fantastic. I'd like to see 3 of those." And before that, I thought to myself, no, I don't work like that. I just make 1 of a thing and then I move on. Making 3 of a thing seems redundant. And I think the history of my practice is one of never settling and sort of moving around from idea to idea within the sort of overarching theme of my work, but also making 3 of one piece didn't make any sense to me. So I sat with it for a while, and I thought, okay, there is a very intelligent woman who knows far more about the history of my medium than I do, who is extremely informed about contemporary art, and who is suggesting to me that I think about something differently. So I was like, all right, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that, but how can I reclaim this dialogue so this piece still makes sense? So I said, all right, we can do this, but I'm going to need access to your antiquities. And she thankfully acquiesced and gave me a list of all of the antiquities they had in the collection here, and the assistance of Mason, the phenomenal registrar who was at the museum at the time. So we spent the day photographing some things and printing them, and then this sort of action, this gesture, became a discussion about institutional authority and the art object and the artist, rather than the dialogue of digital reproduction, downsampling, and sort of real versus artificial objects. So it's a different dialogue for sure, but I think it became one that marked a transition in my practice that allowed me to be more fluid and responsive to the stimuli of my environments, the things that are sort of poking and prodding at me, and not try to confine my work so neatly to a bell jar on a desk. It allowed me to step outside of that and be more nebulous. So I was really happy with the way that piece looked. So the thing that what completes the cycle is the title of each of these panels is the accession number of the piece in the CMA collection, and now the piece has its own, which is it's really nice. I mean, if it ever gets displayed here, there's gonna be like 6 accession numbers on the title tag, and I'm super excited to see that. Okay, so the last bit about Gamut before we move on to some new things, and this is sort of following in that dialogue of malleability. Our perception is also malleable and inconsistent, but it's not flawed. And I think that's a really important notion to me. I think it's important to be responsive and fluid and critical about things around you, and not necessarily beholden to a specific set of views. And that's, I think, one of my favorite things about real hard scientists. But anyway, assuming the notion that flawed perception is assuming that there's some objective truth that can be had. I think that's ultimately my problem. I think color serves as a really great metaphor for this. And we'll go over is anybody in here a graphic designer, or does anyone in here work with Pantone colors? Okay, so we'll do it a little bit. These color charts on this particular piece are Munsell soil color charts. So they are lab manufactured colors that serve as standards under a given set of lighting conditions to allow you to evaluate, measure, and objectify the color of a thing. And I think, but what we don't think about very often is that they are manufactured to be representative in a certain color environment. That color environment almost never exists, except if you bring it with you or take your color to a lab. So it does work really well for quality control and consistency across platforms, but I think the notion that we are trying to objectify color is problematic because it doesn't acknowledge how adaptive and malleable our perception is. So if we look at Pantone 286, which is the closest thing to Yves Klein blue, in this room, it's going to appear yellow, it's going to appear dim. If we take it in the hallway under fluorescent lighting, it's going to be brighter, paler, and greener. But the only time we will see it as it's supposed to be is under diffuse 5,000K, 6,500K lighting in a light box. And I think so we're not really quantifying a color. We're just sort of measuring color in an agreed upon context. And I think what's interesting here is that in our need to quantify, we're in some way limiting our ability to experience. We're offloading our ability and duty to engage in the problem of perception to objective scientific means. And I think that invalidates our experience by viewing this color in any other context, because if we see Yves Klein blue in this room, we might have the notion that we didn't really see it because it wasn't really Yves Klein blue because it wasn't under the right conditions. And I think we're not, in that sense, acknowledging the inherent malleability of the world around us and how adaptive our perceptions are. And I think this is where photography becomes really important to me. And into this discussion, you get a really interesting juxtaposition of hyper-mechanized objective reproduction and some interesting notions of the inherent subjectivity of perception. And I think a few of the things going on in this image and the previous one really do it for me. Largely, it's the contradictions. So the bottom left of this, you see a distance scale, right? And I appropriated this image from the NASA rover. I modified some things and added a couple boxes. But the distance scale really threw me for a loop because it's totally pointless. This is a landscape photograph, so if I were to slide this distance scale up, without knowing how far away this scale is supposed to be, or the angle of view of the camera, this idea of, I'm not supposed to wander, the idea of 50 centimeters at the bottom and the idea of 50 centimeters at the top it's insane. There's no logic there, and I like to think that somewhere at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, somebody knew that, and they just didn't care, and they just let it go because that chart gives it the feeling of science. It looks like an official image, it looks quantifiable, it looks measured, and in all of these things, it adds weight, it adds validity, and it adds context to the image. So what I did to sort of twist that a little bit, I, of course, added space tape, the silver Mylar tape around the frame, because that makes it even more sciencey and even more legit. And I think the exciting aspect of this image to me is how to make legitimate that something that was in so many ways an absolutely functionless object. So any idea of color matching on Mars versus on Earth is almost preposterous because of the atmospheric conditions, distance from the sun, and white point of Mars versus that of Earth. So in any way to adjust something from Mars to be comprehensible and perceivable to our eyes, it already has to be a fallacy. So then I threw on a color chart and then some space tape. But the secret, really nice, and this is when I started to get into this idea of more installation-based work and romanticism, I framed it in an aromatic cedar. So I don't know if any of you smell art, but I do sometimes. But if you smell this one, it pays you back. And I was really excited about that. This is the last piece I'm going to show before I give a little preview of the exhibition that opens Thursday. And I think this is a necessary use of dichotomy and this point-counterpoint with regards to aesthetic and context that informs the little bit remainder of my talk, as well as where I bring it all back to Columbus, the past and the future. And I think this discussion takes the idea of the hand of the artist versus the hand of the knowledge worker. And I think particularly with photographers, there's this notion that the hand of the artist is absent because a device is used to produce the work. And sort of further to that, someone being me, rarely actually operates a camera and often appropriates images. I don't even own a nice camera. So for this image, and then the other images from the Columbus Museum of Art, I just borrowed the registrar's camera. And I think it was an important gesture for me because it enriched that dialogue of institutional authority by using the trappings and equipment of the institution to achieve my means. So it's a pseudo-challenge to the legacy of artistic production and authorship that I think is something I like to head off at the pass in my work, because it's not something that concerns me at all, given my articulation of all photography is fundamentally appropriative, but it is something that I think people tilt their heads at when they are confronted with someone who unabashedly appropriates and recontextualizes work. And a lot of the work I do appropriate is to borrow the title of a really solid book. They're called Useful Pictures. So the Mars images were meant to be useful. The documentation from the Met is meant to be useful. It's meant to convey a specific experience. So it is somewhat devoid of a quote-unquote creative act. And they are images that are utilitarian. And I think aestheticizing and recontextualizing those images is something that I find richly rewarding. So I spent the last 45 minutes discussing the idea that context is king, and part of me feels like a hypocrite because I'm removing half of the context from this exhibition by splitting it up into two sites. But I think this is a significant part of the work. It also provides me the ability to seriously dig deep into two fundamentally different paradigms and present the works, as the undercurrent of this lecture suggests, as a dichotomy. And the first dichotomy I'd like to address is the notion of a two-site exhibition. Having never had the opportunity to present work in two places at once that was the same show, I started to think about what implications that had, right? And the first, there's an important geographical and chronological shift that occurs between the two shows. The show here at Maleka Gallery focuses on South America, Rapa Nui, Machu Picchu, and sort of those sites. The show in New York focuses on the Levant, which is in political dialogues right now. We'll get to that in a minute. And I think while both of these focus on ancient, huge air quotes here, ancient and primitive cultures, I think they, at their core, deal with the notion of removed perception. And the idea of removed perception to me is essentially photographic. It replaces in us the need or desire of having been there that I think is so crucial for a full understanding of a thing. And that comes back to our Machu Picchu discussion. Part of our desire to go to Machu Picchu is removed by having been there in the photograph. Part of it is weakened even if we go there because of the photograph, and then likely the experience that you carry with you of Machu Picchu isn't the vista, it's the hike up the mountain or the diners, or not diners, the meals that you had along the way. So I think much like archival photographs from museums and institutional images, they do their best to capture the likeness, the presence, or the aura of the objects they depict, but they're still not there. There's a slippage between what we perceive as reality and what we perceive as image. And this has been my core concern with the photograph from the last decade. I think the difference, though, is I don't find the slippage to be at all problematic. Conversely, I aim to highlight and celebrate this slippage. In some ways, it is this slippage that I think drives us to explore, wonder, and know. And historically, although the movement wasn't without its problems, the least of which being any sort of balance, I enjoy the romantic notions of Burke's Sublime to discuss this. The Romantics, much like good scientists, albeit with very different means and ways, acknowledge that there's a great deal of mystery in the world. And the difference comes when scientists want to investigate and solve this mystery and romantics want to celebrate it. And I value both quite highly. And I think it's this dichotomy that brings me to the metaphor of the, again, huge air quotes, primitive people, who are, and I think the problem I have with the way we culturally depict them is that they are celebrated for their ingenuity and craftsmanship as one celebrates a child drawing a stick drawing, right? They're not genuinely acknowledged for their massive cultural contributions, both scientific, cultural, etc. And I think so the exhibition at Maleka Gallery focuses on 14th century South America and Rapa Nui, and the exhibition at Dennery Gallery focuses on 2000 BCE to 0 BCE Levant. And the Levant is the region that is defined as sort of the Fertile Crescent, basically contemporary Middle East. If you've heard ISIS referred to as ISIL in the news recently, that's Islamic State in the Levant. The Levant is the region that compromises Jordan, Israel, Syria, Egypt sometimes, that sort of ancient Near East region. And I think our perceptions are worlds apart on these two places, but we group them in, I think, far too readily with one another. And I think although the Levant as a region governs either through religion, history, or energy policy a great deal of world politics, but culturally I think we group these civilizations in 2000 BCE with the Aztecs, Mayans, and Incans in the 14th century, ignoring the fact that Machu Picchu was constructed in the time of Michelangelo and 500 years after the founding of Oxford University. And therein lies the rub for me. We celebrate Isaac Newton as one of the greatest minds in history while ignoring the unquantifiable contributions of what we often classify as a quote-unquote primitive people. A cursory Google search reveals Levant is the home to the birthplace of writing, mathematics, literature, the wheel, banking, astronomy, and a code of laws, among myriad things. I found out today, also locks. They had locks 3,000 years ago with keys. Mind-boggling. So I think ultimately my pendulum is swinging wildly, and that much I can say. And I've recently found myself celebrating some of the concerns, ideas, and aesthetics of Romanticism, but I don't want to get carried away with that notion. I'm not at all taking an anti-logic or a willfully ignorant stance, which is my primary beef with Romanticism, but I'm absolutely suggesting that maybe a little bit of poetry is a good thing. There's a strong divide, I think, between what people think science is and what science actually is. And I think that can likely be said for any discipline, including art, but the way I view science is the way I view theory. It is our best guess at the moment of how the universe is held together. Good science, real science, peer-reviewed science, acknowledges that any moment, everything, literally everything, can be turned on its head. As soon as firm proof appears, one paradox that gets proposed that challenges our notions, they'll lay it all down. They're like, all right, we were wrong. What next? And I think there's a confidence and an open-mindedness and a beauty in that I think we can adapt readily in our lives with a little combination, with a willingness to celebrate the unknown and deal with that idea of the scientific celebration of it. And I think that's what's truly magical. It's these people that dedicate their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, and they are ready to lay down centuries of understanding as soon as there's solid proof. The earth moves around the sun, but we didn't know it until 1514, and it wasn't accepted until much later. But that doesn't mean we were wrong before, we just didn't have proof. Indian astronomers correctly calculated a great deal of astronomical constants through observation and postulation while still believing in a universe where the sun rotates around the earth. And it's that area that I wish to celebrate. The thinkers who existed before certainty, those who paved the way for our futures, for what they built that allows us to remove ourselves from the concerns of chronology and geography and to celebrate the richness of history and our ability to step outside of that cloud. And just like that, I sort of find my foothold in the universe, and that to me is the photograph. I work from them, trying to bridge histories and geographies that are beyond my ability to experience, to truly experience, all the while accepting and preparing to lay it all down if something more appropriate comes along. Thank you.